Welcome to a new episode of the Tolkien Experience podcast. I'm Sarah Westvick.
I'm Sarah Brown.
And I'm Luke Shelton.
Each episode, we share with you an interview of a Tolkien scholar or fan.
That's right. In these interviews, one of us asks our guest to respond to 6 questions that help us learn about their personal Tolkien experience.
All of this is made possible by our supporters on Patreon, so we want to thank them and encourage you to check out the community at patreon.com/TolkienExperience.
We are so excited to share this podcast with you, so without any more delay, let me introduce our guest. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Tolkien Experience podcast. I am thrilled today to welcome our next guest, Sonali Chunodkar. Sonali is an independent researcher who wrote her MPhil thesis in 2014 on a cognitive narratological examination of how Tolkien's narrative and stylistic choices are able to achieve secondary belief with the help of a reader's co-creative activity. Her PhD was written in 2019 and attempted a Husserlian phenomenological exposition into the possibility of literary belief during the act of reading in general and that of Tolkien's fantasy fiction in particular. She recently presented papers at the Tolkien Society Seminars on Tolkien's reception in India and on the Marathi translation of Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. Sonali, it is wonderful to have you on the podcast. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
So happy to hear that. So let's start at the beginning of, where this entire journey began for you. How were you introduced to Tolkien's work?
I've had introductions to Tolkien's works. And as the cliche goes, the third time does it. So that was the case with me. So the first time, and it's been 20 years now, exactly 20 years now, because for this podcast, I had to go back to my memories and, calculate the time and I did that for the first time, and I discovered that it's been 20 years since I was first introduced to Tolkien's works in any form, but Tolkien's works. So my first experience of Tolkien was in a movie theater. I was watching The Lord of the Rings. The first part of that movie, I was not particularly impressed. I wasn't particularly impressed because I found Frodo to be somewhat of a whiny, crybaby kind of person in the first part of the movie. But I found the music quite haunting. I found Anya's song quite haunting, and I had gooseflesh on me during that time. So this was in 2002, because the India release for Lord of the Rings happened a year later from the global release. So it was in 2002 that Lord of the Rings, the first part, The Fellowship of the Ring, got released in India. The thing was, right after that movie, I also saw The Phantom Menace. Immediately after it. So that's why I had to go back and, look at the dates, what the dates were, because my memory was telling me this. And, if you look up in Wikipedia and all that, it's 2001. So something's wrong there. So that's why I went and checked in. And it was 2002. And that was new for me as well. It's just like you don't calculate these things when you're, experiencing the whole thing. So I saw The Phantom Menace. I was a Star Wars fan. I was a Star Trek fan. So that was what remained in my mind. So a couple of years later, my brother, who had newly joined a university, used to come over during the weekends. So my brother, his name's Apurva. I'll call him Apurva from now on. He used to come home from the weekend during the weekends. And during one weekend, he brought home a book to read. And now this book was this big. This was in one volume, Lord of the Rings in one volume. So that's a very big book, sorry. It was hardbound. The cover was removed, so it was already used and, it had those signs of wear and tear. And he was reading that book over the weekend. Now, I was naturally curious about what this book was. So when he wasn't reading it, I took it with me. Like, I just opened the pages, scanned it a bit. And the first thing that struck me was, who the hell reads these kinds of books, these big bound novels? And I'm like, who the hell reads them? When I started scanning those pages, I was like, who the hell writes these books? Because yeah, so that was something, that struck me. Who wrote this? Who spent so much time and energy writing this? And even though I had this memory of the movie, I wasn't really interested in reading that book. But then I saw the appendices, because when I was scanning, I went to the back as well. I saw the appendices, and you have calendars there. You had these scripts there, and these are visual things. They pop up to your attention. You are captured by the whole weirdness of it, the whole alienness of it, because you don't really find books which have these weird scripts in them, these calendars in them. And that is what struck me from that point. And I still remember this even after so many years. I remember that particular book, which I never read because I didn't read it. Because he used to come over the weekends. Apro used to come over the weekends. He used to stay for 2 days. He used to go back. I never had a chance of reading them. So when he read those books, he had seen the movies as well. By this time, the third movie had come out, and this was in 2004. So he had watched the movies. He wanted to come home. He wanted to share them with me. Something of, a kind of nostalgia for our childhood days when we used to watch stuff together. So he wanted to continue it. And he had watched the movie. He thought I would like it. So he came home with the movies, CDs of the movies. And we started watching it. So we had some kind of argument at that point in time about who gets the couch. And this is important. This will be important later on. Who gets the couch and who has to sit on the uncomfortable chair in front of the TV. So naturally, he won that argument. He got to sleep on the couch and watch it. I had to sit on this, somewhat uncomfortable chair and, watch this marathon of a movie. So at that point in time, I saw it, in one go, all three movies in one go. So the first movie I was somewhat familiar with. I wasn't really taken by. The second movie got a little bit interesting. It got a bit interesting. The hook that captured me came in the third movie. This was the scene with Eowyn. Eowyn killing, revealing her full glorious self and killing the Witch King of Agma. And that scene was what captured me in a way that has not quite left me, even after these years. So there I was on that sofa chair. We call it a sofa chair here. You might call it as I don't know what you call it, but here we call it a sofa chair. It's uncomfortable. I'm on the edge of my seat. I am like, I feel a bit ashamed to say this, but I was going to clap in the confines of my own home and stuff like that, because that was like,
Not
that was
something
the
to be
moment.
ashamed of.
That was when I was going to clap. I was just going to clap. I may have clapped and stuff. And I'm looking at my brother, like, because, I want to share that moment with him. Did you look? Did you see what happened? Did you see what happened? He was sleeping by then.
No.
I was there all alone in this excitable state. And I was like, did you see that? And he was sleeping. Which is why
Oh my
I
gosh.
am glad I didn't take the sofa that day. Which is why I'm glad, because then I would be the one who would be sleeping. Then life would have taken a completely different turn altogether, and I wouldn't be here talking to you.
Right.
I mean, that's how it goes, right? The road goes on and on and on, and I found myself here today talking to you because I did not take that sofa to sleep on. So when this whole thing happened, the next time I found myself near a bookstore. Naturally, I bought the book for myself. The book that I thought, who the hell reads such books? I was going to be the one who was going to read that book. So I got the book. I also bought one other book. I will not name that book. I still remember the store where I bought it because I've never been there since. So this was a paperback book. It wasn't as fancy as the one that my brother got it from the library, from his university library. So this one was paperback. It had Alan Lee's illustration of Gandalf on it. So that was when, so I came home and I started reading it. This was in 2004. I started reading it. I did not sleep that night properly.
Really?
So I was so much, it was kind of a frenzied reading because I was like so into, because the book's different, right? The book's quite different from the movies in many places. So I was so much interested in knowing how different it was, what new thing is there in that. I did not sleep properly. It was, and the whole thing was like, okay, I'll stay awake for 5 minutes more and then I'll go to sleep. Okay, just this chapter. I'll finish this chapter and then I'll go to sleep. Now I've stayed awake for so much. Why not 5 more minutes and 10 more minutes? So in that way, like in those 5 minutes, 15 minutes, only this chapter, I'll finish this chapter and go to sleep. I stayed awake till 5 in the morning reading.
Oh my goodness.
I only went to sleep after that because that was the time my father got up. And my father's an early riser. And I was sure to get a lecture about horrible sleeping patterns at that point in time. So to escape that lecture, I went to bed. But I did not quite sleep because at this point in time, the whole thing is going through my head. Because all that I've read, all those wonderful bits about, all the dialogues, those things about Strider, about Sam, all the history behind it. Who is Beren? Who the hell is Beren? Who?
Who
All
the hell
that.
is Beren?
Nobody knows because.
Wow.
So day 2 starts a bit late, but it starts nonetheless. I don't sleep properly on that day as well. The same thing happens that day. 5 minutes. I think I had a good deal. I spent the whole day reading, and then spend the whole night reading, doing that
Wow.
5 minutes.
That's amazing.
So this happened for 3 days. By the third day, early morning, I had finished the book. The first frenzied reading of the book. The very frenzied reading of the book. A day or two went, resting and, mulching over what was read in the interim period and all that. And then I started again. A much more, what do you call it? A much more steady, slow savoring of the book. Now that I know what all is in it, a much more slow savoring of the book. So that after that, I think I've been reading mostly every year. Like more or less every year until the time I actually started to do research on it, because that was the time I did not read it every year. It's ironic about it, something really ironic about it, that when I'm not doing research on it, I was reading it every year, but when I was doing research about it, I wasn't quite reading it every year of that point in time. Very ironic about it. So when I read The Lord of the Rings, and I had the book, I asked my brother to get for me the Silmarillion, because there were a lot of things in The Lord of the Rings that I couldn't quite find an answer to, even in the appendices, because I was, mining the appendices for who the hell Beren is, who is Turin, what's the deal with the cats of Queen Beruthiel. I mean, that's a fascinating character, and I thought perhaps, okay, the Silmarillion might provide answers to it. So I got the Silmarillion. I did read it in the night, but not so much. I was somewhat more disciplined about it. Let's call us disciplined. Then came The Unfinished Tales. I got the Unfinished Tales from my brother. I read that, and then I read The Hobbit, and The Hobbit was a disappointment.
Oh, right.
Because when you read everything and then you are expecting something about, what's the deal with all these people, and then you come across The Hobbit, and I don't think I've ever liked The Hobbit as much because of the order of reading, as opposed to anything wrong with the book itself. Because I was steadily
Yeah.
going from here, like Lord of the Rings, Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales. I even ended up reading Sigurd and Gudrun once or twice.
Oh, wow.
So that was like, The Hobbit became somewhat of a disappointment for me.
Understandably, yeah.
So that's the story of how I got introduced and hooked, completely hooked, weirdly hooked.
That is terrific. Yeah, no, amazingly hooked. I love
Yeah.
how many different like entrances you had. Like, it's nice because I was also introduced to the films as well, and the thing that struck me about it, because I was too young to understand what was happening at the time, was also the music. So I loved hearing that was also kind of like
Yeah.
what struck you the first time you saw it was so like really impactful.
Yeah.
And I just love the story about your brother falling asleep. That's terrific. I think it's one of the most memorable memorable stories.
Yeah. Like, if he hadn't taken that if he hadn't taken the sofa, if he hadn't taken the couch, I wouldn't be here. That's how impactful that episode is. Yeah.
That's amazing. I love that. That's terrific. Well, you've highlighted some really interesting things here about about what was really calling to you in the text and how that led you onto the path that was not so much in the direction of the Hobbit, but more into the deeper like lore of like Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales. So, I'm curious if you could tell us what is your favorite part or parts of Tolkien's work.
Now I have many parts, and it changes like with how
Yeah.
old I am, what kind of situation I am in currently. So nowadays I find the House of Healing quite something that calls to me. The whole chapter on the House of Healing, that calls to me. I kind of like the restful bits that are in the text, in the Lord of the Rings in particular. I like, because there is this scene in Lord of the Rings in the House of Healing where you have Gandalf talking about, it's a very very understated moment in which he points out that, okay, Eowyn was would have been a woman, but she has the capacities to match any of the other characters, the male characters in particular. And that is something that calls to me. I like the whole the banter between Merry and Pippin and the members of the three walkers or something. Oh, I forget what they are called in that. Aragorn,
Three hunters.
three hunters, yeah. Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas, when they are when in Flotsam and Jetsam, when they meet again, and there's this friendly banter between them with this undertone of seriousness that is going on. That's something I find, nowadays I find the restful bits quite. Um, I favor those as opposed to the whole "I will go and kill the Witch King of Agmar" bit. Because
Yeah,
those
yeah, yeah.
that had a moment. Now this has a moment.
No, that makes a lot of sense.
It's more of the sad moments that I kind of like. So that's one thing. I was There was this one scene. It's not quite a favorite of mine. That's the thing. It's not quite a favorite of mine, but it does have an impact, a kind of effective impact. When I was editing, during going through the last rounds of editing my PhD thesis, there was something I was writing about how there is a kind of empathic appropriation of something in the text so that it applies to one's own life. So one uses it to make sense of one's own life. And this was a time when I had, my supervisor had died quite suddenly. So there was this one passage that I had already written. It was already incorporated in my text, about how Frodo dies, and Sam thinks that Frodo's dead, and Sam has to go on his own and complete the mission, and the kind of dilemma
Mm.
that he is in that point in time. So when I was going through my own text and reading it as opposed to, writing it or something of that sort, that carried a new meaning for me at that point in time. And I was a bit, distraught
Mm.
about from reading it, because I had never had that kind of, um, association attached with that particular passage when I was including it in my text. But when I was reading it at that point in time, that had, so a comforting impact, but not
Mm.
quite my favorite. These things are not really
Right.
something one remembers with a good deal of fondness, but they do offer a good deal of consolation.
Yeah.
So I found his text quite consoling over the years. The whole, um, we have to do it even if we are going to fail in doing it. It's better to do it. So those kinds of messages, those kinds of counseling words, I suppose, those have played a good deal, a good, what would you call it? A kind of impact, a kind of influence on the ways in which I approach all my dilemmas. And I have pretty few. I do like Strider. A Strider part of it is also, yes, the
Mm.
chapter on Strider, where, because the line, all that is gold does not glitter, it matches me as well. I'm going to be very shameless about this and say that it goes with me as well. So I am going to, so that's one thing that also is something I've completely appropriated over the years. So that is a chapter I kind of like, because here is this not so great looking, God knows who that person is, character. He might be completely evil. He might be completely evil. But, the way he's trying to build trust, the way he's trying
Mm.
to reach out and build trust on his own rather than relying on Gandalf's letter and all that, that is something that also has, a kind of, that's quite stayed with me over the years. And then you have Bali Man,
Mm.
who ends up saying, okay, he with the crown and all towards the end, because he can't believe it. What are we coming to?
Yeah.
Why,
Yeah.
why does he like my peer? Those are the kinds of things. This is something. Also, there is this one thing. I think this must be well known, but I was introduced to it via my supervisor, who told me that the Lord of the Rings is almost can applicative, if you like. You can call it allegorical. It's not quite allegorical, because allegory is quite a contested term in Tolkien studies. So that is
Mm-hmm,
not
mm-hmm.
something one can use quite freely. So let's call it applicability. And one of the things that it is applicable to is the whole journey of a PhD uh, research, from start to finish. Your supervisor dies in the middle like Gandalf, and you never see the side of him again by the time you have reached Mount Doom and you have to throw your thesis into the volcano. And that is something that's a very
Oh, man.
funny and, funny but heartbreaking kind of analogy that
Mhm,
he had pointed out to me back in the day, and I find that really funny even today.
mhm.
And I think people should use that with their students when they
Hmm.
say what a PhD journey is like. It's like this.
It is this. We have it all set out in this massive book. This is what it's like.
Yeah.
Uh, that's terrific. Thank you for sharing that with us. I really resonate with what you said about like the softer moments and the consolation, like really like speaking to you now, because I feel the same, especially after the past couple of years. Like I found a lot of as you say, like comfort as well as courage in different ways from different parts of the book, which is it's really wonderful. And as you say, like the applicability of the text is really interesting, because it just comes like, at different points in your life and like different things, and like you realize certain resonances that may not have applied to you before, which is wonderful. It just makes the book so, and the stories in general, so multi layered. That's terrific. So with all of these like experiences you've had, and with all of the readings of the books that you've done over the years, and your involvement in like writing your PhD, and then presenting at conferences and stuff, among all of that, what would you say is your fondest experience of Tolkien's work?
When I was when I knew that I was going to get to do my research on Tolkien, because that's a big thing for me, particularly in a place like India, and that was, I think that was 10 years ago now. In 2012, I did try. I had tried applying for PhDs elsewhere, but that didn't quite work out. So my father told me, "Why don't you go apply for Pune University?" And I was like, "Why should I go leave my own city and go there?" He said, "To get some experience in being rejected." My father's wonderful like that. I was like, okay, that seems like a sound advice. I'll go to Pune just to, get rejected, to get some experience in being rejected. So I went to Pune. So the kind of process here is like you have to have you have a written exam, and then you have an interview for admissions. So that's how the process goes. So I went for the written exam, and there I find one question: write an essay on fantasy fiction. And I was like, okay.
Okay.
I was like,
Interesting.
okay, is this the same fantasy fiction that I have in mind? And I was doing this mental scan of what exactly they might be referring to other than the fantasy fiction that I know of. And I couldn't think of anything else. So I was like, this is one moment. I'm going to write what I want when I have never gotten a chance before. I'm going to write what I want, what I like, as if I'm never going to get a chance again. So I wrote that essay on fantasy fiction. I wrote about Tolkien, I wrote about Lewis, I wrote about the Inklings, I wrote about possible worlds and God knows what crap. I was like, okay, that's done. So the interview comes in. This is the first time I meet the person who will eventually become my supervisor. And I'm sitting there, and I was answering questions, and I was so overjoyed in answering questions on Tolkien, because he was asking questions on Tolkien. And I was like, okay, you know Tolkien? I was like going in my mind, do you know, like, this guy knows Tolkien? And I was really happy about that.
Amazing.
Yeah, because not everyone was familiar with the books as much as they are with the movies. And here in an official, an official academic setting, you're being asked questions about Tolkien. And I was like, so yes, I was answering it. And even answering that was a kind of joy. And I was like, okay, if this is what an experience of being rejected is like, I'm going to master the art of being rejected or something of that sort. But I didn't get rejected and all that. I was told that this person who was asking me questions about Tolkien, this is on the day when I was paying my admission fees, securing my admission, that he had written, that was the first time I came to know that this person had written his own dissertation on Tolkien.
Oh, no way.
I was completely overjoyed because I was like, I don't mind working with anyone. I was that naive. I don't mind working with anyone as long as you let me work on Tolkien. And that was a steep learning curve after that. But I think I managed a bit. So that was my fondest experience. There were many fond moments. The fondest experience I've already told you about, with watching the movies, getting hooked. And this was the second defining moment. And because of that, I wouldn't have changed anything about it. It was like you get some kind of official recognition for that. that was wonderful for me, to make it official, have it that tinge of respectability, academic respectability to it. So that was one of my finest moments, getting to work on Tolkien and everything like that.
I love that. That's wonderful, and especially as you say, because it's like, with fantasy fiction in general, but especially I guess more contemporary writers or contemporary in the sense of like mid 20th century writers like Tolkien. It feels like it's like nowadays it's more, I guess, accepted to do research on such authors, but there's still this kind of like veneer of like, oh, are you serious about like studying fantasy and everything? And it's just nice to get that stamp of approval from
Yeah,
like actual professors that,
yeah,
like, yes, this is something we study
yeah.
academically. So I'm actually curious because you did mention a little bit about how it's like it's not really like common in India to, I guess, study Tolkien, and I know you've presented about receptions of Tolkien
Mm.
in India in the past, like academically and socially. Do you want to expand a little bit on that?
Nowadays, you don't have much of a problem, but back then, you didn't know where to go, like whether it did have that tinge of respectability. Right now, it's much more common because um, it has that,
Okay, good.
it's already got that veneer of respectability. Like even in my case, while there were no um, in Pune University in particular, while there were no PhD theses or MPhil theses at that point in time, between the time my supervisor wrote it and I had started out. After that, there have been a lot of attempts to write about not just Tolkien but also other kinds of fantasy fiction. So yes, there is a budding scholarship in that sense. Science fiction, there is a lot of scholarship, but yeah, now good
Okay.
universities do have departments, but let's see how it goes. Mm.
Hopefully it keeps building. It's nice to
Hopefully.
know that there is like a bit of a community there
Yeah.
now.
Like fans are of, I don't know about fan communities, but fans are of course there with their own silent voices
Yeah,
and all
yeah,
that. I'm
certainly.
not really a part of organized fandom as such. Much more introverted for that, but I'm sure there would be
Mhm.
some kind of fantasy fiction enthusiast group or something of the sort. I'm not particularly certain where to find them, but there might be, and secret voices remain.
Very true. Very true.
Yeah.
That's wonderful to hear. So, like knowing this journey that you've gone through from being introduced back through the films, and then now, having done your PhD, would you say that the way you approach Tolkien's work has changed over time? Is there any like red thread, I guess, that's gone through your entire journey, or has it changed quite a lot since the beginning?
It has changed a lot in a sense. When I was starting out, like I've mentioned before, I was much more curious about finding more about stuff, like finding more about who the hell Baron is, who, like those gaps, filling in those kinds of gaps in my, uh, ignorance. I was much more concerned with that. I read a lot for that sake to know more about um, the kind of backstories, the kind of history that was going on in that text. But when I started doing my research, I started becoming more self reflexive. So I was much more concerned about what it is I was doing when I was reading these things. I, I was much more interested in um, what is going into um, my meaning making of that text, what is going into what kind of imagery I that is um, that I'm associating with the text. And one of the things that has changed drastically is that I'm much more content with my ignorance today than I was back then. So
Okay.
I am completely okay today with not knowing who the hell this fantastic character of Queen Beruthiel is. I'm okay with that and made my peace with that.
Yeah.
That's one of the most distinct differences between then and now in my case, but more or less I'm continuing that. I don't think that um, my love for the work has any way diminished in that sense. So that is something that um remains a constant, even if
Mm-hmm.
my approach to it, my my criticisms of the work, because now I'm also in a place where I don't mind criticizing the work as well, because it's not
Right.
always
Yeah.
roses, there are thorns as well, and the work is imperfect, there are problem areas. um, so I am much more comfortable loving a work while knowing that it has distinct problematic flaws.
Mm-hmm.
One more thing. When I was starting reading Tolkien's works, I was influenced by the movies. Hence, I thought Sam was white, a white colored character.
Right.
So over the past, like,
Mm-hmm.
it was only past recent years that I discovered, when I was, stopping and examining the ways in which I was reading. This was for my PhD research. That I discovered that, okay, something's wrong here. Sam's described as brown.
Yeah. Yeah.
So why do I think that? And this is just one moment. There are several other ways, in which, even if I am reading the text, I'm not really reading the text. I'm just imagining what I already know from other sources.
Mm-mm-mm.
So that's one thing. So my Gandalf the Grey has always been, like Ian McKellen in one sense, from Alan Lee's portraiture, from the movies. So my imagination of Gandalf is this grey washed character. But
Mm-mm-mm.
the books don't have a grey washed character. The book has a blue hat, I think a blue scarf, or was it a silver scarf, a blue hat,
Yeah.
that kind of character. So there's a discrepancy in what I'm reading, what is there in the book, what I'm reading, and what I'm imagining and associating with that. So that is one thing that I've
Right.
learned to. It's a work in progress. So I'm just discovering all that even today. So the same work ends up getting read in so many ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, wonderful! That is so interesting. Like everything you mentioned about I guess the ability to, again, like, to be able to criticize something you love. I feel like it's a very important skill in general, and it's kind of the thing that I guess only time kind of gets you to that point. Like time and the
Time
ability to,
and a
like, get from the
certain,
frenzied reading to the
yeah, time and a certain
yeah
comfortableness with knowing that you love the work regardless of
yeah
your criticism of it. You don't have to prove to a horde of masses that, okay, I am criticizing the work, but I do love it, or something of the sort. That is not something that affects me anymore.
That's great. That's wonderful.
Yeah,
I like that. It feels like, I don't know, for me, I feel like it frees up so much more, like, room to, like, explore and, like, love the texts, because
yeah,
you can just do so kind of, like, with no bounds, which is wonderful. And I love the point you made about the, I guess, kind of the way that the visual culture of, like, Lord of the Rings in our pop cultural landscape, because of the films and the artwork, like, it's interesting that it can be so pervasive to the minds of,
yeah,
of fans like yourself and other fans too, even though the books don't always support that, and they kind of have their own
yeah.
ecosystem there.
In a sense, yeah. And that's the joy of it as well, that you're trying to discover it with every reading as such,
Yeah.
because every reading you can end up getting something new, something has much more sense than it previously did, because you know something more from some other source.
Yes, true, very true. I love that. So with all of this in hand, would you ever recommend Tolkien's work? Why or why not?
Of course I would recommend Tolkien's work. I've been trying that. I might be failing in doing that. I have tried to get my own parents to read it, since
Mm-hmm.
completely unsuccessfully, since
Mm-hmm.
the first time I read it, and it's been what, 20 years, unsuccessful. completely unsuccessful in that.
Oh no.
But they belong to a generation where uh, they were much more enthusiastic about science fiction as opposed to, fantasy fiction and such.
Okay.
So that
Right.
has been a complete failure. They have not yet watched the movies, despite my several attempts at doing so. I have had some success, some in among peer groups and all that. But yeah, but yes, I would still continue recommending it. I would continue to recommend not just the Lord of the Rings or the Silmarillion and all that, but even the history of Middle Earth. The history of Middle Earth
As well.
has, yes, the history of Middle Earth is. I am not really someone who is very much into collecting books and trying to build a
Mm-mm.
collection of books. But my pride and joy is the 12-volume History of Middle Earth series, which I somehow managed to procure um, during the early days of my MPhil from my brother who now stays in the US. So that is my pride and joy.
Mm-hmm.
And I would nowadays it is much more cheaper because you get Kindle editions for those as well. Back then we didn't get Kindle editions. And I have
Yeah.
some of them are hardbound copies. So I would definitely recommend reading at least the Book of Lost Tales parts 1 and 2, because there has been a lot of chatter about, when the diversity seminar took place about mythology for England, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good place to start reading for to know what that mythology is about, the mythology of England,
Yeah.
where it comes into its own is in the Book of Lost Tales parts 1 and 2. I also
Mm-hmm.
find like while I've read the Silmarillion and the other bits about the children of Hurin, the unfinished tales, the one tale that has haunted me as such from the Silmarillion, the materials, the legendarium, has been the fall of Gondolin from the Book of Lost Tales
Mm-hmm.
part 2. And in that particular version, which also has, I think it's the first appearance of Legolas Greenleaf of the House of Tree, besides
Uh-huh.
Glorfindel. Um, that particular version has been most effective in one sense because of the way in which he's describing all these battalions of elves who are gathered to defend their city from onslaught, and
Mm-hmm.
the way he describes each and every one of them with the house of the king, the house of the tree, which is the one that comes to mind right now, um, the house of the fountain. You have Ectelion of the fountain there, and the way he describes them with with the colors of their vestments, the sigils on their banners, and then he
Mm.
shows all of them being destroyed. Yeah, the way in which he describes the beauty of it, only to show that all of this is lost forever, needlessly lost. That has a relevance.
Yes.
And that keeps on coming to mind nowadays over the past few months. That is the tale that
Mm.
haunts. Uh, it literally haunts you, when you think about it, of all the good things that are lost needlessly. And it's almost become a condition of life today, um, with
Mm.
all that has been going on. That is one tale one should read, just to feel, if you haven't yet felt it, if you're away from it, to feel that sense of loss.
Yeah.
Because that
Definitely.
that in that particular version of the tale, of version of the fall of Gondolin, he achieves that poignancy which he hasn't quite achieved in some of the other versions, like from the Silmarillion. That's almost that's pretty flat. In the Unfinished Tales, you don't really get to that point. You just have Tuor coming to Gondolin. But in the Book of Lost Tales, the version that is there, that particular version is perhaps something that people should read. I really think people should read.
Yeah, really pierces the heart. And as you say, it has a distressingly apt relevance, I think, especially in the past few months. Yeah, very, very, very much agree. That's a wonderful recommendation. So this has been absolutely terrific. Before we go, I'd love to know what kind of, if there's any Tolkien project or work that you're currently doing that you would like our listeners to know about.
Okay, I will be presenting a short paper at the PCA conference. It's forthcoming as of today. It's called Tolkienian Pharmacon for our times, but I'll be preparing a much more longer version for Robin Ann Reed's anthology, which is titled Race, Racisms, and Racists. A pretty loaded title, but hopefully it will be impactful. It's subtitled Essays on J.R.R. Tolkien's Legendarium Adaptations and Readers. It's under contract with McFarland. And I'll be preparing a much more longer version for that. It's titled, as of now, A Tolkienian Pharmacon for Shared Ailments, extending reflections on the fantasy genre. Now, in this particular paper, I am planning to, I hope that I will achieve that, is to look, to trace, to examine, critically examine the significant influence of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, even Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, but Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, on the formative texts of the subgenre of mythological fantasy fiction in English in India. Now, this was created in the early 2000s when the movies was coming out. So there was already audience for those kinds of texts because these were more local. So what has happened is that both on the part of the authors, these are formative texts, so we are not looking at a lot of authors, we're looking at, a couple of authors, and these authors have been significantly influenced by Tolkien's works. They have borrowed a lot of Tolkienian elements, and they have introduced them into the mythological textual traditions which are already here, such as the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, but let's focus on the Ramayana. So that is something that I'm looking at. I'm going to look at quite critically and quite in depth, hopefully, if I get the space for it. The thing is, both the authors and the kind of existing scholarship that is centered around these texts, they don't quite acknowledge or are ignorant of the extent to which these authors have borrowed from Tolkien.
Right.
So, and the thing is that not all these borrowings are good ones. They are not really. So what remains at times is potentially problematic in Tolkien might end up coming to full flowering in these works.
I see. Okay.
And the kind of impact these works would have on young minds is perhaps much more troubling to me, much more concerning to me, because everyone is living in a time of crisis right now. So is the kind of culture here. So the thing is, these kinds of texts do have impact on young minds, and I'm looking at those. I'm looking at how these elements have been borrowed, deployed, often uncritically. They haven't been properly negotiated. The thing is that when it comes to mythological texts in particular, while these things have been introduced, borrowed from Tolkien, there is also some precedent for these problematic tropes already existing in works that were written during the turn of the century when the Indian nationalist movement was on the upscale. So we have Chandrakanta, which you might have heard about from the Tolkien and Diversity conference. So a text like Chandrakanta also indulged in particularly problematic tropes, but those were somewhat different from the kind of problematic tropes that are there in Tolkien. they are there, but they are quite different. And I'm tracing those. I'm putting these texts which are there not just as a part of the Tolkienian tradition, but also the tradition that comes from Indian language literatures like Hindi
Right.
from that particular time, even today, converging in works which are post Tolkienian, like, you have the very famous Bahubali movies. So that is something that I'm doing. And I'm hoping that there will be further scholarship on that matter, because this is not one person's job. You need people to, train critical lenses, engage with texts, not just from India, but from outside, from the Western tradition, and give them their own um, due acknowledgement, so to speak. So there is a certain curative aspect in that as well. So that is something that I'm hoping to prepare. Hopefully, I'll get to prepare that as part of Robin and Reed's forthcoming anthology.
Mm-hmm.
Um, might do justice to that. Hopefully, we'll be able to do justice to that. We also need more scholarship from other countries as well, particularly countries which are not US, UK, or Australia, because when you're talking about binaries like the global north and the global south, when you're talking about uh, white people and people of color, there are others or other binaries in play also. So those also need to be incorporated and dealt with critically, because that is the duty of those who are engaging in research. So that kind of duty is something that one has to
Yes.
fulfill. So that is something that I'm doing, which is much more Tolkienian. Now, the shadow of Tolkien, of
Mm-hmm.
course, falls in a way on almost everything I do. So I am also
Mm-hmm.
preparing a paper which is tentatively titled "Being in the Theatre." This is for a volume. I think it's for a volume for contributions to Phenomenology series. The volume is tentatively titled Phenomenology in India, Themes for the 21st Century. I'm co-editing it with Professor
Mm-hmm.
Nicholas D. Warren of Penn State University, and he's also a Tolkien fan. He's quite interested in it, and I've got to know a couple of really obscure philosophical comparison or potential comparative sources from him. So I'm thinking of, one day in the distant future, working on that as well. But for the paper
Yes.
itself, I'll be looking at fairy and drama as one model. I'll
Mm-hmm.
be incorporating it. It won't be all about Tolkien, but of course, Tolkien will make his way, and um, somehow,
Certainly.
because it's a literary muse for me. It's a constant literary muse for me. Those
Mm-hmm.
works are literary muse for me. So fairy and drama becomes this kind of model which looks at the possibility of belief in a theatrical experience.
Mm-hmm.
So while Tolkien was talking about it in terms of kind of imagining it as something that the elves might produce, which model also has relevance today, because we are now moving into a world of immersive realities with meta and the possibility of what all that is going to happen. Now you have reports of sexual assaults being possible in the metaverse. So that becomes a kind of theoretical model
Mm-hmm.
that gains relevance outside Tolkien studies. So that
Yeah.
particular model is something that I'll be incorporating. I was recently reading
Mm-hmm.
Dimitra Fimi's wonderful monograph on Tolkien race and cultural history. And in that, she gives a comparatively more elaborated account of Tolkien's own experience of Peter Pan, the stage production of Peter Pan. And and I think she's the only one that I've read who gives an idea of what exactly he was experiencing in a theater at that point in time. The whole clap,
Mm-hmm.
if you believe in the immediacy, the kind of call that is made for the audience to believe in magic. And I'm going to incorporate this model also, because phenomenologists may not be aware of these models, and that is something that I'm hoping to introduce to phenomenology, because phenomenologists are still, looking at it from the point of view of there being a kind of suspension of belief in the theater kind of thing. So that's something I'm hoping to introduce to phenomenologists. So these are two things that I'm hoping to complete this year somehow, hopefully.
That's wonderful. I'm sure you can do it. And I'm really looking forward to hopefully reading both of these because the topics sound fantastic. And I think they're going to be wonderful additions both to the corpus on Tolkien research, which, as you say, it's very important to expand that corpus in terms of the binaries you were speaking about, and the different dynamics around the world, and to get that diversity of scholarship so we can have, not to say as complete a critical landscape as we can of Tolkien, but something along those lines. A very inclusive critical landscape of his work, and also what you're going to contribute to phenomenology. That sounds fascinating as well. It's not a field I'm familiar with, but I kind of want to get familiar with it now after hearing you speak about it.
Best of luck. Best of luck.
Thank you. Well, Sonali, it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for being on the Tolkien Experience podcast. It was wonderful to have you.
I had much fun talking to you today and sharing my own experiences. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to do that, because these opportunities come few and far between, because normally we deal with research, not with our own personal stories as such. So this is, I think, the first place I have told my story as such. So thank you for the opportunity. I enjoyed a lot today.
I'm so happy to hear that. That's wonderful. Well, I mean, that's what the podcast is for. It's this space to, connect us as, not just as scholars, but as fans and as people who have these wonderful experiences with the texts that we engage in and that we love. Well, thank you again so much. We are so thankful that we have such gracious scholars and fans who want to share the Tolkien experience with us and with you.
We really enjoy making these podcasts, and the fun doesn't stop here.
That's right, it continues on social media. You can find us on Facebook as Tolkien Experience and Twitter as @TolkienEXP. Don't forget to like, follow, share and comment, because we love interacting with you just as much as we enjoy talking to our guests.
For even more content and to join our fellowship of supporters, check out our Patreon by going to patreon.com/Tolkien Experience. Finally, you can also follow our personal Twitter accounts. I'm @LukeB.Shelton.
I'm @SR.Westvic.
And I'm @Aaron L. Palmadill. If you have questions or comments, you can send them to us by email at tolkienexperience@gmail.com.
If you want to know more about this week's guest, we provide show notes at tolkienexperience.com. You can find the podcast on all major podcast services, including Apple, Stitcher, and YouTube. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast wherever you listen to it.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, and we truly hope that, in a way, it contributes to your own Tolkien experience.